Well, welcome everyone. I'm Phoebe Arslanagić-Little. I'm a senior fellow at the SMF. I'm also director of Bloom and head of the New York Parents at the think tank Onward. I work on the birth rate challenge and how we can help more people to have the children that they want. Some housekeeping. The fire exit is there. Please don't go in this direction if there is a fire. The event's also being live streamed. The camera is going to be focused on the speakers, but I believe that during the Q&A, if you ask a question, the camera will pan to you, and you might be on the live stream too. But we are all here today not only because we want our moment in the sun on the live stream, but because we want to know, at the first Tory conference opposition in 14 years, can the Conservatives only in future win from the centre ground? In defeat, the Conservatives are in their period of introspection, strategic debate, dissection. Some of you will be enjoying that, and others will find it galvanising, and others will kind of wish that it was all already over. Do the Tories try and win back Liberal and middle class voters, or do they lean rightwards to re-establish themselves as the party of the working class cohorts who delivered them victory in 2019 under Boris Johnson? It's complicated, because this year, as everyone knows, the Conservatives led voters from every direction, retaining just half of its 2019 voting coalition. Conservative defectors in urban areas were more likely to go to Labour, and rural areas to the Lib Dems, but overall, it's to Reform that previously Tory voters were most likely to go. In a recent interview with The Spectator, Kemi Badenoch, who's had lots of eventful interviews recently, spoke about knocking on one door during this year's election campaign to be told that Tories were just too left-wing. Next door to be told they're just too right-wing. Next door to be told they're just too centrist. And she went on to say, real politics is about real leadership. It's all about trying to split the difference between what different cohorts of voters want. Jeremy, for his part, has emphasised immigration as responsible for loss. Cleverly and Julian have both spoken a lot about the loss of public trust. In 1975, Keith Joseph warned Tory conference in Blackpool not to seek the centre ground, which he called a will-o'-the-wisp that we follow at our peril, but instead the common ground. He identified the common ground as consisting of values, including the wish for greater mutual prosperity, for a safe and law-abiding society. Is Keith Joseph's warning about the centre ground, that it's an ephemeral political compromise that's shaped by left-wing extremists and doesn't really exist anywhere in the country except in SW1, true? Or is the real danger to Conservative power and renewed relevance a rightward lurch? So here to discuss if the Conservatives can indeed only win from the centre ground in the future, we're joined by Liam Halligan, columnist at the Daily Telegraph and a member of the SMF's Policy Advisory Board, James Crouch, Head of Policy at the Pollster Opinion, Ross Munro, Head of Strategic Communications at the SMF. We're going to have 5 minutes from each of our panellists, and I'm going to get the discussion going, have some questions for them myself, and I'm going to open the floor up to you all. And just before we close, I'm going to ask each of our speakers for their reflections. So we'll go to James first, then Liam, then Ross. James.
Thanks, Phoebe. In trying to kind of provide an answer to this, the main thing that really struck me is there's almost a paradox at the heart of British politics, which is that the next election, both parties could supposedly win it without winning a single other vote from the other side. Mathematically, in a lot of ways, it works. And I think there's a huge amount of incentives for both parties to not really look at each other, but to look at their own sort of crumbling bases. I mean, I'm sure the Labour Party would love to win back the communities that abandoned it en masse a few months ago. I'm sure a lot of people in this room would love to win back the people in the 50s and their 60s more than anything that abandoned the party this time. But ultimately, politics of the next 4 years will still be played out with Labour governing and the Conservatives opposing that government. So I think the incentives do put the Conservative Party almost in a bit of a danger zone, is how does it actually respond to Labour rather than focus on trying to outmaneuver Reform? And is that basically the kind of sensible state of play? And I think the big answer to that is the Conservatives need to go back to finding a big, broad offer that actually works for a pretty sizable number of people. Now, I know that sounds like it might be a little bit wishy-washy, but I do actually like to return back to what I call the broad church of 2019. And I know that a lot of people who probably agree with where my argument might be going, also probably a little bit horrified when I talk about 2019 in that way. But the mythology of 2019 is that it was basically a party that got elected on a pretty hardcore platform. And that isn't really the case, and it isn't really what happened. Quite a lot of that approach from Johnson's government has actually had an offering on public services, had an offering on building, had an offering on green growth, had an offering on levelling up. I mean, Hartlepool by-election in 21 wasn't one on Brexit, it was one on levelling up. So I'm one of those people who thinks that 2019, in a sense, is a little bit of a chef's kiss of centrists, the point of that is bringing a diverse range of people who actually don't agree with each other on an awful lot of other things under one banner. And that is basically what winning 45% of the vote looks like. Because I can tell you right now that 45% of the public do not agree on a lot of things, but you need that for a broad coalition. If I want to bring it forward to this year, and something a little bit closer than 2019, we asked voters, well, why do you think the Conservatives lost the last election? Number one is their behaviour. Number two is their record. And number three is their leadership. We put 6 things, and policy comes really near the bottom and quite further back. So the Conservatives ran into an election where people thought they were behaving badly, achieving little, and were poorly led. And that is absolutely toxic for any party interested in trying to govern the country. And so really, that requires a pretty deep, broad response. And policy isn't going to do it. It's not the starting point at the very, very least. Now, what that big thing looks like is really complicated. I think we're going to find that out pretty quickly. But later, the Conservatives lost a lot of votes in a lot of places to a lot of different parties, and it's pretty hard to put it all back together again. But it's important to try, is the key thing. And I'm emphatically not saying that immigration and an offering to reform isn't a really big part of that. It is a really big part of it. But one, it really does have to be part of a bigger package. And two, it has to be made with arguments that people outside of the comfort zone are going to be really interested in hearing. You have to try and make arguments on immigration that, a 20-year-old might be prepared to listen to and respond to in some way. Now, some might call this the centre. I'm broadly talking about it more as a mindset of trying to talk to the entire country rather than a mindset of marketing the party to specific segments of the vote. And that is the key thing. And I think that mindset of really genuinely trying to talk to the whole country at once gets you much further with all of those different people than what the party was attempting to do for at least the last couple of years of the last parliament.
Thank you very much, James. Liam.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back at the SMF. As a young student in my 20s, I actually helped set up the SMF with people whose names are now well known in politics, people like Danny Finkelstein, David Owen, who of course was very well known back then, Robert Skidelsky. It's nice to still be associated with the SMF, and it's nice to see that it's still doing interesting work many years on. They're not that many years. Not that old. So what I'm going to say is based on my experience, not so much as an economist, but as a reporter. I am, first and foremost, somebody who talks to members of the public, and I don't so very often put their words in speech marks in papers these days, but they do influence me, and I do write lots of columns based on what I've heard from ordinary people going to see them in their factories, in their homes, wherever. And so my conclusion, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, and it might not be popular in this room or even with the SMF, is that the so-called centre ground that we talk about in Westminster, in the bubble, in media land, in SW1, the centre ground, the sort of polite, nice dinner party centre ground, isn't actually where most of the population is. I think most of the population is to the right of that Westminster-focused centre ground. And I think that's particularly the case with natural Conservative voters. And I think that's been the case for many years. It's almost a cliche in politics that the Conservative Parliamentary Party is always well to the left of the Conservative Party in the country. And I think there's some crossover there. Of course, I'm not saying that all voters are members of a Conservative Party activists. Of course they're not. But there's an awful lot of red wall voters who are also to the right, if you want to use old money, of the so-called Westminster centre ground. And the three main policy areas, there are more, but the three main policy areas I'd focus on in the next couple of minutes are net zero, immigration, and tax and spend. On net zero, you guys may not be seen dead at a TUC conference, but you want to watch the TUC conference from earlier this month. You want to watch Gary Smith's speech. You want to watch Sharon Graham's speech. These people are enormously influential. They run, respectively, the third and the second biggest unions in this country, the GMB and Unite. And they are absolutely spitting tacks about Ed Miliband being off the leash. Sharon Graham, who's a very powerful orator, she, and not without political talent, by the way, she was basically evoking the miners' strike, right? For people my age and older in the room, you know, the low point of British post-war industrial relations, like, you know, running battles between the police on horseback and blokes in donkey jackets with blood coming down their face. It was really serious stuff. And many people in this room will have first become interested in politics about that time. And you had Sharon Graham at a TUC conference, the first TUC conference in 14 years when Labour were in power, warning an incumbent Labour Prime Minister that he was not going to make today's miners of workers in the North Sea. 30,000 workers whose livelihood has just been completely eviscerated by one stroke of Ed Miliband's pen. Now, I'm not here to say that there isn't a very worthwhile and useful and even eventually economically beneficial transition to be made away from fossil fuels. I've supported that all my adult life, a long time before it became trendy, by the way. But what I am saying is that people need to hear that the Tory party get this, and the Tory party care more about people's jobs now than they do about poncing about at international conferences when they've left office. That's point one. And almost all the country is, you know, nowhere near a lot of the country is nowhere near the centre ground as we define it in Westminster. They are like, what does this mean for my job? Can I buy a car? Etc. etc. Even if their kids don't believe that, an awful lot of grown-up voters do. And the Tories need to reflect that without throwing, you know, going completely nuts and saying, we don't believe in any of this, it's all mad. It isn't all mad. We do need to get off fossil fuels for all kinds of geopolitical reasons. But in doing so, we shouldn't be bankrupting ourselves. We shouldn't be leaving big parts of the country that are industrialized, completely de-industrialized. And we shouldn't be doing anything that threatens for the lights to go out. And if those of us who are watching very closely what the national grid's doing, what the energy mix is, that is not out of the question. And I'm very careful about writing that stuff. But you know, this is a specialised audience and very heavy people in the industry. They don't say it on the record, but that's what they say. Briefly, immigration, of course. I think the Conservative Party's woken up to the fact that a lot of people are very concerned, particularly if they're fighting for state-backed resources, if it's social housing, or they haven't got, as most people in this room will have, recourse to private healthcare. This stuff really, really matters. Thank God we've got to a point in this country where we can actually talk about this without being called racists. You know, I'm an Irish Catholic. Dad came over from County Mayo. I'm a racist because I'm talking about immigration. I'm completely mad. But at least now we have got to the point where we can have that discussion. It's only taken us 25 years, but we got there in the end. Finally, on tax and spend, you know, the pollsters will say, won't they, everybody wants lower taxes, but everybody wants better public services. And of course they do. But there's a gap there for the Tories. Talk about waste. Because everybody who works in the public sector, they talk to people like me off the record about waste and how much waste there is. Let's talk about the morality, ladies and gentlemen, of spending £89 billion a year on debt interest on our national debt, which is more than we spend on schools. So we're spending more servicing our national debt, not paying it back, servicing our national debt every year, 89 billion this year, according to the OBR. It'll probably be more because they got their interest rate predictions wrong. 89 billion quid is more than we spend on schools. We're spending that on debt interest. I think Conservatives should be highlighting that. I think they should be saying this is completely mad. There must be a better way to run our country, because no one would run their business like this. 89 billion pounds. Crikey, that's like 8p on income tax just to pay debt interest. Why is it that the only person I hear talking about this, even among Conservatives, is me?
Thank you, Liam.
So yeah, I'm, as introduced, I'm Ross Munro. I'm the head of strategic comms for the Social Market Foundation, and we're a centre-ground think tank that authors thought around how to make markets work better for everybody. For the first time in my political life, in my voting life, and for many of your voting lives, we're going into a stage where we don't have a Conservative government. The Tories lost, and they lost badly. And there are a number of factors for that, but what the party seems to be most fixated on is the vote that went over to reform. And that in and of itself suggests that the party should move to the right. But for me, that's the easy answer, right? That's not having to adapt your ideology to match the needs of the wider public. And polls show that immigration, whilst persuasive, was not the key behind the vote to turn away from the Tories. Things like the state of the NHS and the economy were two very big factors in the reasoning behind that. So for me, given that, the idea that Liz Truss put out earlier in her chat with the Telegraph was that the party's lack of kind of ideological rightness is really for the birds. The reason why the Tories lost was because they lost their reputation for competence, of course, and fiscal competence mainly. There was also a lack of top-down vision. I was here last year, and the key policy announcements were the advanced British standards and the smoking ban. That doesn't deliver a kind of cohesive policy plan for the party. For me, what the next government needs to do is listen. And listen without ideological bias, and build up that reputation for competence and deliver a plan around it. For me, it's pragmatism, not centrism, that's going to make the difference. It's understanding public sentiment and acting on it. It's not reasonable to think that when the NHS is in crisis and then when people can't afford to heat their homes or pay their mortgage, that the Conservatives can rely on their political brand to win elections. But this new strategy is not necessarily incompatible with Conservative ideals. They just need to make sure that markets work for everyone, and that's what we do promote here at the NHS, big plug, at the SMF, big plug, sorry, wrong acronym. And we give those on the right the space to do that. I think at the core of it, I'd like to just finish off with a quote from Michael Gove in an SMF report from 2005. The markets the Conservatives should be in the business of defending are the social markets. We need social markets that work for everybody to persuade them to vote for the Conservatives again.
Thank you, Ross. I want to just quickly, I want to start actually with this point about the centre ground and the broader country. It doesn't actually reflect the centre ground in SW1. I met someone recently. She doesn't work in politics. She doesn't really follow politics.
Really?
I know.
There are people like that?
I know. And she's like 30. And I was talking to her about politics and what she thinks about stuff. And three things jumped out at me, which I think together are. She had voted for Blair. She had voted for Cameron. And she thought the death penalty was a really good idea. I was like, oh my God.
Majority of people do.
Person.
Majority of people
a normal person. Exactly. Like, how often do you meet someone like that? And SW1? You don't. Of course you don't. And yet, actually, I've been really enjoying going around and telling lots of people who work in think tanks and policy about this woman. And I'm like, wow, incredible! I'm like, no, this is actually like what many people think, and this is completely normal. So to start with you, James, this disconnect though, hasn't that always been the case? Could we have been sitting here in the 80s and the 90s making the exact same point and saying the centre ground in SW1 is not the same as the centre ground in the rest of the country? How has this been dealt with before? Is it just always the case?
Well, I think with some of those examples, we all kind of let history play tricks on us. So we all kind of try and remember back, and we think of actually Blair was X here on the spectrum, and Cameron was here, and Johnson was here, and things like this. I mean, one of the things that I always, to people's horror, try and do is actually say that there's actually quite a lot of continuity in the Conservative offer, bizarrely from 21 to 2015, 17, 19. I mean, we all kind of forget now that Cameron's government was the government of a 100k immigration cap and the hostile environment. And that was also a government that elected MPs in central London, across all swathes of very, very liberal middle-class Britain. Unfortunately, Brexit did a job of kind of drawing a dividing line somewhere and radicalising people on either side of it. But for the most part, actually, that government wasn't particularly left-wing in any way, shape or form. So I think we tend to over-rationalise where everyone sits on these spectrums and make it quite sensible and uniform. I think we all kind of trick ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. Liam, James said earlier, he emphasised that what had emerged in terms of what people's problem had been, why they had not voted Conservative, their behaviour, leadership and record. Not so much policy, but actually what you're speaking about feels more like policy, but policy communicated through the lens of what to see for my job, my car, my life. Is it actually more policy, but is there just a major communications issue here, or how to actually frame these things?
I think it's a combination. I think Ros is exactly right. There was a competence thing. I mean, let's be clear. Again, I take my life in my hands. I'm on a panel with a pollster, but people abandoned the Tories. Labour didn't really win the last election. People abandoned the Tories, and that's clear from the numbers. We're all obviously fixated on the parliamentary seats, but Starmer got 33% of a 60% turnout, which was 20% when I was at school. So 4 out of 5 people didn't vote for Starmer. So this is no great, expression of the British people's love for soft left policies. The Lib Dems, they may have got 72 seats. They got 11% of the vote, and Farage got 14% of the vote. I got 5 seats, right? And he came second in like 110 seats. So these guys they're going to get a lot more than, by the end of this parliament, I think they'll have a lot more than 5 seats. I think they'll have 10 or 15 seats because they'll win by-elections. And if this leadership election goes a certain way that certain parts of the parliamentary party don't want, then they're going to defect because they're going to think this is my only chance of staying. So I really wish it were true that the vast majority of voters out there were sort of cuddly and nice, decent, middle-class people, as we may style ourselves. But there's an awful lot of fear out there, right? Go to Aberdeen, where I just was recently. Go to Mansfield. Go to Lee Anderson's constituency in the old Nottingham pit villages. There's a lot of fear out there. And I think, just as in the late 70s, when I was around, very much politically sentient, right, Charlie, I think there's a sense among the public, which in my experience is nearly always way ahead of the political and media class in their thinking of what's actually happening and what's going on in the real world. I think the public who didn't vote for Starmer in droves at all, they voted against the Tories, I think they're expecting some pretty bad stuff to come down the track with the public finances, with electricity supply, with geopolitics, with, I hesitate to say this, and I wouldn't write this in a newspaper. We're a live stream, so I won't say it. There's all kinds of fears that we can all imagine that are out there. And just as in the late 70s, a certain Conservative leader who was disdained by her party for, quotes, buying her own furniture and being a bit low rent from a, unfashionable part of the country, she was completely right. It took her 4 or 5 years to prove it, and the Wets had their say. The Jim Pryors and the sulky Ted Heaths. And she basically proved them wrong. And so that when she did her policies, which were obviously really, really painful for a lot of people in the country, and the memory of those still lingers, she had a broad swathe of public opinion on her side. I mean, that's a really simplistic potted history, but that's broadly what happened. Everyone was telling Margaret Thatcher that she was far too right-wing in the early 80s until she wasn't. And again, don't shoot the messenger. This is just what happened. And we don't repeat history, but history often rhymes. And I do sense that we've got energy security issues, we've got big geopolitical issues, we've got a lot of political volatility, we've got resurgent trade unions, we've got the highest strike action since the late 70s, and half the public sector is still unionised, by the way. It's only 25% of the workforce as a whole, less than the 70s. But we're still in a position where there's a lot of fear out there, and when there's fear out there, which there is, people don't want cuddly governments. They want the firm hand of leadership. And I think you could look at the results of the last election. Again, I tip my hat to the pollster on the audience, on the panel. You could look at those results and interpret them in a completely different way if you look at the popular vote. And if you consider that the really important dynamic wasn't just the 4.5 million odd votes that Reform got, 650,000 more than the Lib Dems, by the way. It wasn't just that Starmer got fewer votes than Corbyn. In both 2017, when he did quite well, and in 2019, when he got mullered, right? Corbyn still got more votes in 2019. Repeat, he still got more votes in 2019 than Starmer did. Starmer is not popular at all, and you shouldn't go out chasing after Starmer's votes, because that's a really crowded marketplace. And in the end, the most important thing at this conference isn't anything that I say, believe it or not, or that anyone says. The most important thing about this conference, and the most important question facing the Conservative Party now, is if the public gets so upset with Labour over the next few years that you guys are on again, are you going to be able to do a deal with Reform? Because if you're not, you're going to let Labour in again, and the public won't thank you for it. In fact, they'll hate you for a generation if you do that. If the right can't sort itself out to be competent, party of government, whatever that means for a deal with Reform, you have to sort this out. And going back, the centre ground's nice and cuddly, and you don't have to deal with difficult people because everyone agrees. But I don't think that's where the votes are at a time like this, because there's fear out there. And when there's fear, people want firm leadership.
Well, I've got a question for Oz before we open it up to everyone. But first, James, the pollster, what are your thoughts on what Liam said?
I'm not sure, actually. I disagree hugely. I think one of the things that bringing it back to the delivery point, if we talk about the issue of immigration specifically, one of the really big challenges, the government kept bringing about policies that were targeted at Reform. And the bizarre scenario we used to get was we would poll levels of support for the policies, and Reform voters would say they supported the policies to the tune of like 80, 90%, like very ridiculous numbers, saying that they supported the policies of the government. But when it came to trust to deliver on the issue itself, that level was about 8, 9, 10%. And so that trust to delivery is absolutely fundamental. It's kind of bringing it back to, remember, you're elected to achieve outcomes, not to deliver policy that kind of just responds to whatever kind of message is out there. So very much agree. It's a huge problem for the party, but it does have to be based on kind of the delivery aspect and that kind of trust aspect. But I also do think that, as I say, we are still going to play out that's currently in there. Basically, all the stuff that should be blue in our charts has gone to the dark grey, none of the above column. Bring those people back. But that's the tough act, and it will have to be played out against Starmer's agenda, not against Nigel Farage's.
Yes, Roz. I mean, how do you show competence in how do you show competence in opposition? Do you just wait for the government to trip up?
Good question.
How do we?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I think I think the party needs to model it all the way through. I think it needs to have some sort of mechanism for having those conversations with the public to understand what the key issues are. I mean, you've only got to look at the fall in the female vote from 30% in 2010. Women voting Conservative down to 6% in the last election, and the way that female voters went at this general election, the 19 to 24 age demographic of female Conservative voters largely went over to Greens. So it's about kind of being able to take everybody with the party, and I think that's the circle it needs to square, really. So it's about that listening. It's about having those conversations with members as well, because obviously they're at the very heart of their local communities. They understand, okay, there's a difference there, of course, but it's important that the party gets them involved as well, and is able to, have that top-down strategy, like we said before.
Ross?
There were many women, of course, who, as Ros rightly says, left the Tories and voted for the Lib Dems or the Greens. But so I co-present Planet Normal, which is a big Telegraph podcast, and we get about 1,000 emails a day from listeners. And so many of those listeners are women, and so many of our listeners vote Reform or just didn't vote. These are the envelope stuffers who stop stuffing envelopes. So yeah, you can see a movement in the polls from the Tories towards the so-called centre ground. I wouldn't call the Greens centre ground. Some of their policies are pretty mad. Not all of them. There's lots of them that are very interesting, but I don't think they're centre ground by any definition. But the really big thing that happened in the election is that 4.5 million people voted Reform, some of whom will have voted Labour in the past, but the majority of whom would have voted Tories. And then there's another 3 or 4 million who just didn't turn up, and they were almost all Tories. That's what the polls show. So there's an awful lot of votes there waiting that aren't going to be impressed if the Tories are, trying to out Miliband, or out Ed Davey.
Questions from the audience? Yes, this lady here.
It's Lucy here from the Higher Education Policy Institute. How far do the panelists think a Trump victory will affect thinking about the centre ground? Will it make people more likely to go right or to the centre or elsewhere? In this country, how far will it affect politics in this country?
How will a Trump victory in this country affect politics? What do you think, James?
I think it affects policy more only really in the foreign affairs space. I mean, it's one of those. I think we love obsessing about American politics, and I think the timing of the US election also played probably into Rishi Sunak's decision probably to call election earlier rather than November, like we all expected him to. But I don't think it does really play a huge amount of difference. I mean, we had Blair work with Clinton, we had Blair work with Bush. I think it very rarely has a huge impact, apart from really big shifts, for example, with Thatcher and Reagan, and us all believing that actually the whole Western world is basically singing from the same hymn sheet. Sadly, it doesn't really do that anymore. But that's probably one of the few examples where kind of a cross-Atlantic convergence in opinion really made a difference in impacting politics domestically, probably as well. But I don't think it necessarily does in this case.
I'd be really interested to see how that extrapolates in the party. I think what a Trump presidency might do is galvanise the right of the party and make them feel more morally justified. And obviously, the Conservative Party has always been a really broad church, and it's each side keeping each other in check that previously has led to their electoral success. So what that looks like with one side feeling more morally justified than another it would be really interesting to see.
Well, my fellow panelists have made some good points about US and UK politics and the relationship between them. We obviously follow US politics a lot closer than we do continental European politics, because I think if we closely followed continental European politics, we wouldn't be having this discussion or debate. If you look at what's happening in Germany, in Austria, in Sweden, in Finland, in Italy, in Spain, shall I go on? I just pulled up a thing here. Incredibly, in the latest French EU election, 18 to 24-year-olds, I've got the numbers here, in 2019, 14% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for Rassemblement National, so Le Pen's party. So it's 14% in 2019. In 2024, it was 39%. Absolutely unbelievable. So there's a lot of what's happening in Europe, and I say this with huge regrets, is we're seeing that unless mainstream parties start to reflect the real fears and concerns of ordinary people, then non-mainstream, quite nasty parties enter the mainstream. Yeah, that's what's happening in Europe. It's happening in incredibly successful advanced countries that are very close to our own: Germany, France, Italy, Spain. And so we should be focusing on European politics, but we don't, because of course we've got so many cousins in America. In my case, literally 33. My first cousins were born in America, big Irish family. But I would tentatively challenge Ros, if I may. I actually think that if Trump wins, Trump is sui generis, right? He's in a different category. There will be such shock and horror and sort of performative, even from lots of people on the right, that it's going to make it harder for people in this country to vote for a party that identifies with the right, because Trump will be so universally panned, even by people who secretly support him. But that's what happens when the media all goes in one direction. It takes really brave people to say, actually, no, I don't agree with anyone. So I think a Trump victory will be treated with such horror in the salons and the conversazione groups, which I'm clearly a big part, that it will shock people. And I think Starmer quietly, while he'll do all the diplomatic things as grown-up countries always do, and the civil service, I think he'll be saying, we don't want to be like them.
Thank you for your question. That was very interesting.
Very good.
Other questions? Yes, this lady here.
You mentioned potentially being willing to do a deal with reform down the line, but I was curious because this sounded interesting to me as well, but I was in another session earlier from Onward where they did Breaking Blue, I think, their report on what people care about. And I think one of the things people were least interested in was a deal with reform, which I was actually kind of surprised to learn about. So I guess, what's your answer?
Because at the moment they're sick and tired of politics. Because normal people have had enough of politics since 2014. What, another one? Brendan from Bristol. They don't want to hear about irrelevant Tories and irrelevant reform people doing deals. They just want, electricity they can afford. They just want to know what sort of car they should buy. They want to know if their kid can buy a house. But let me tell you, if Labour are really, really bad and the signs aren't good, with the best will in the world, I want any government to do well for my country, believe it or not. I'm not a particularly tribal person. But if Labour do really badly, which I think they might, I was at the 97 Labour conference as a reporter, lobby correspondent for the FT, and it was very different to last week. It was a rally. It was a massive celebration, and last week's was not a celebration. It was a very carefully managed. They got through it. So let me tell you, if Labour are really bad and the country's saying, we better get the other lot in again, and the right is arguing with itself within the Tory party because they haven't made a clear decision in the next month to this question, which way I think they should go, and then Farage and whoever it is are having huge rows, then all the country's going to think they're all as bad as each other. They just want a choice between, they just want to be able to pick someone who they can broadly trust to be competent, even if they don't agree with them on everything. They don't really care about the mechanics. Is it any wonder the general public doesn't want politicians doing backroom deals in smoke-filled rooms? Of course they don't. It's massively distasteful. But it'll be even more distasteful if in 2029 we've had a guilt crisis, whatever's happened, that the right is not ready to govern. That will be an existential threat to this party's future. If you haven't got your ducks in a row, either this party itself is in a position to govern, or you need to do with reform, whatever it is. It's not an option to pretend they're not there. They're there. And they got 4.5 million votes, and another 4 million of your voters, almost all your voters, didn't vote for you because of them. That's why you lost, big time.
James, do you they're sick of politicking? You seem to get that's absolutely right. Do we really just have a month to sort this out? Are we actually just setting the course that we must set for the rest of Parliament now?
Well, I don't know how any of you feel about the leadership race, but I'm not sure I don't feel like we know what course we're precisely going to go on for the next 4 years. I mean, most of the people in a lot of the kind of corporates who were at Labour conference last week said that they don't really know where they stand until they get a little bit more from Labour. So it's also kind of actually probably surprisingly left the Conservative Party not really knowing precisely what it's reacting against in the leader it picks. So we're all kind of existing in this political vacuum that was surprises last 3 months after the general election.
Yeah.
I do think in terms of the polling as well, I think the individual voters before and after the election from the Tory side and Reform side also weren't particularly keen on there being a deal. No. I think everyone just didn't really like to think of it in that way. And I don't think we really think about politics in that way. So in terms of what kind of the Tory party dealing with reform looks like though, I think one of the things that's different to 1997, as Liam kind of rightly mentions, is that Blair was on about 80% approval ratings. And actually, one of the reasons why William Hague kind of went down the journey he eventually went down is because he was basically so frightened of the Conservative Party breaking up under the sheer weight of obvious defeat facing him that it was safer to kind of tap to a kind of more safer Conservative message, stick to the 30%, bank it, and then we come back to the next election, we survive to fight another day. Keir Starmer's already on minus 30% approval rating, but they've not really done anything. And also because they're only starting on 34% of the vote, one of the little magics of how polling figures kind of work is we always do net approval figures. And so when your actual core supporters only make up a third of the vote, everything looks like very large negatives very quickly. So he's really going to have a parliament of pretty bad polling figures. Theoretically, could still sort through them and win. But it's not going to look pretty for Labour very quickly. So the new leader who's going to come in, unless they really rescue it in this budget, which is going to be quite impressive to see if they do. How? I agree.
What are they going to say?
Yeah, exactly. It means that they've just got a little bit more breathing space than William Hague had in the equivalent position, just a little bit more that allows them to do maybe something a little bit different and stops worrying about reform breathing down their neck.
James. Here.
Does it make any difference who the Tories choose? By which I mean, when you look at previous Tory contests, I feel that the difference between, say, Ken Clarke and John Redwood was more pronounced than the choice the Tories faced this election.
That's a brilliant question. I think it does matter who they choose. So I'm in a privileged position, not a member of the Westminster Bubble at all. I obviously know all the leadership candidates. I've interviewed them all. And I think they're all good people. And I think we're lucky that all of them are in our public life, by the way. Not a very typical thing you hear from a journalist, but that's how I feel about it. Politics is really hard. It's really hard on people's personal lives, on their families, and they're all decent people. I personally think if the Tories go for a more centrist kind of unity candidate, I think a lot of the public will say, oh, they just don't get it, do they? I genuinely believe that. Of course, a lot of Westminster-based folk are, Tom Tugendhat's the lobby's favourite. Well, of course he is, because he's a nice Tory. He's a sort of Tory you can take home to your mum, even if your mum lives and listens to him, right? But is that really what the public wants? More that kind of vibe? I don't think they do. I think the public want to be led. The public are concerned about their economic futures and about their kids' economic futures, and they're concerned that power is seeping away from the Western world. They're concerned they're being railroaded into buying a car they don't want when 60% of those cars are made in China. They can work out that this is going to be really bad for our automotive industry, and that's 1 million people in parts of the country where good jobs are quite scarce, and these are good jobs. So you're right, Theo. That was a sort of post-Cold War world, wasn't it? We talked about politics in big, bold, primary colours. You had the suede-shoed, jazz-loving, cigar-toting, brilliant company Ken Clark versus a Vulcan, who's also a really good company, by the way. Good spin bowler. You knew that about John Redwood. Now the gaps, the differences, the clear blue water, if you like, between the various Tory candidates is much, much narrower. But again, that's part of the problem, because the public are looking on saying, understandably, they're all the same. It's all kind of robo management speak. There's no kind of passion in this. What do these people really stand for? What do they represent? What can I hang my hat on when I look at this politician as a potential leader of our country at a very difficult time? So the fact that there's more there's fewer gaps, doesn't mean that the party's in a better position. It may mean that the party's further away from where the public is. And I'm a professional economic and political journalist. I love think tanks. I've helped set this one up. I like coming here and talking. I love the political process. And it pains me to say, I'm not trying to do it to be smart ass, that so many of people who do what I do are out of touch with how ordinary people think and feel, but I genuinely think they are. And a lot of the problem is my so-called trade. Journalism isn't nearly as representative as ordinary people as it was when I became a journalist in the mid-90s. It's a very closed shop these days, and I think that's another major problem, but probably a subject for another fringe meeting.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm going to go straight to more questions, actually. Yes, this gentleman at the back.
Thank you. My name is Brian Weller. Just wonders, don't you think that being a centrist costs a huge amount of money in national investment in infrastructure and expects people not to be political in their voting analysis? And don't you think the centre ground has been completely destroyed by mass migration for the extra costs in the infrastructure? They just can't afford it.
James, can I go to you first?
I think what I want to say is almost Brexit is probably one of the things that's probably been very unhelpful in kind of destroying the centre ground, because I tend to think that actually the Conservative offering probably sits quite comfortably in the centre ground, which is usually something that's a little bit traditional, something that's a little bit modern, something that also includes kind of low immigration, and you bring it all together. And the problem is that Brexit, while seemingly working one general election, has done a really good job at actually detaching loads of different strands of the Conservative Party. And so where does the centre sit if you're trying to chase all of them at once when they all look very, very different and they don't really speak to each other? But I almost kind of want to bring back in something that Liam said, which is people want to be led. And you can bring in things like high degree of investment with low immigration, and you can bring that together as one kind of thing and one kind of offer. I'm one of those people who tends to think that actually, if you marry something like a low immigration offer with how that responds to the housing crisis, especially in the cost of housing for people in their 20s and 30s, and you really marry up that argument, I think that's pretty politically potent.
Mm.
I don't think Labour can reach it. But it's centre ground, like that straddles an awful lot of different people in a way that actually Labour can't do. Conservative Party should be interested in doing it.
Agree with that, Liam?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I don't want to sort of counter everything I've just said, but I've said everything I've said in the context of the fact that, unless this party is a broad enough church to win, then you won't win. It's always been a broad church. That's why it's been in power more than any other country, because you're shapeshifters, right? That's part of politics, is responding to what's happening in the real world. And what's happening in the real world has changed quite a lot in the last 5 or 10 years. I wrote a book on housing a few years ago called Home Truth. And, as I said, I'm from an immigrant community. I grew up in an immigrant community. It was a pretty tight immigrant community in the 70s and 80s, if you were called Liam Halligan, right? I mean, it was quite difficult. And so I understand what it's like to be part of an immigrant community. I also know what it's like to be part of an immigrant community, and then you benefit massively from social mobility. And this country has a genius for that, and we don't want to stop that. But when I wrote the book, I actually did a whole chapter on why immigration wasn't the reason why house prices were so unaffordable. And I believed that at that time, but since then we've gone from 300,000 a year to 750,000 a year, right? And in the end, the numbers change, the facts change, you change your mind. And I reread that chapter a couple of nights ago, and a lot of the arguments are still there. Look, immigrant communities build houses. I know every one of my relatives who's come here, they must have built about 50 houses each person, includes the women and kids as well. When you think about what people like my dad and my siblings do, they're building houses all the time. But I think in the last few years, this confluence of really high net immigration, despite the Brexit vote, right, that sends people mad. The amount of really kind of decent Remain people who I know, many of whom I'm related to and love, they're like, okay, you got your way on Brexit, you arsehole, but you guys haven't even done it. I mean, what was all this for? Why is immigration still 750,000 or 700,000 a year? So I think that's a major, major problem. And also, war on the European mainland. I mean, come on, there's some heavy stuff going down. This is the time for some leadership. And I think the political class ignores that at its peril.
I think the other point to make there is, I said, I think the key issue there is delivery, and we need to deliver better public services. That's just a fact of the matter. You cannot be a government also without a social conscience. So actually investing in those services is absolutely key, I think.
Thank you, Ros. I think we'll have one more question. Can I take this gentleman here, and then we'll go to wrap-up comments from our panelists.
I've never understood why people in the private sector like Labour, because Labour governments always take money from the private sector and give it to their friends in the public sector, and it's been even worse in the last few months. So why doesn't the Tory party bang on about this? Why don't they say we're going to stop this gravy train? Now, I know that that's going to lead to the mother of all struggles and endless strikes, but it's a fight that's got to happen in the end, because public sector pensions, the cost of it, that's running away with the public finances. The public services are very inefficient because it's impossible to sack anybody. Should not the Tory party be making a point about this, and how do you think this issue will play out this time?
Thank you for your question. James, I'll ask you to answer that, and then we'll go to wrap-up comments.
I think the answer is that, especially under 40s by this point, quite a lot of them have been quite put off by what the Conservative Party basically had to say for a couple of years. And it goes back to my point around having that kind of broader offering, which balances out the thing that one group really passionately wants us to focus on and marrying it up with something that people who are working age effectively are more interested in. I mean, my absolute key example is really the general election, where yes, the Conservative Party talked about lower taxes, but then also brought in a policy, for example, the first week was dominated by national service. And the point is that there really isn't anyone under the age of 45 who found that particularly appealing as a policy. And also it also speaks to a lot of the policies that the government did over the past 2 years, the last government did over the past 2 years, which is actually something that's quite divisive within its own kind of potential voter base. And a lot of the people it was usually divisive basically siphoned off, but people who were actually well paid in the private sector in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s. Those are the kind of people that the government never really spoke to for quite a long period of time, and they noticed it. Now, I think Labour's doing an awful lot of things that gives the Conservatives space to start talking to them again, but they can't rely on that alone. I think they have to come back with some big offerings on things like housing, on things like maternity and paternity leave, on things like investing, and also I'm a big one for some form of offering on graduate repayments as well, especially since Labour's just jacked up the fees for their own voters, which is remarkable. But remember, up until recently, graduates used to be Tory voters, and in lots of parts of the South, if you were a graduate, you tended to be a Tory voter, and if you weren't, you tended to not be. And quite a lot of those people, the Conservatives just haven't been interested in for quite a long time.
Thank you, James. So I'm going to go to Ros, then Liam, and then you, James, for closing remarks. And if you could please be quite brief.
I think that essentially what this argument boils down to is it's not a case of whether the party should move to the left or the right or to the centre. It's really about having competence and having a leader that is trusted to deliver that, who's able to deliver a clear strategic vision. The party needs to articulate that. The party needs to understand how, to coin a D-Ring-based phrase, of how things can only get better. So thank you.
Ros, Liam.
Well done. I think the party does have to decide, because I think the public needs to understand what you represent, what you stand for. And I think it will become increasingly obvious over the next 2 to 4 years that a lot of the policy positions that the Tory party has been very flexible in embracing and being part of and not rejecting will turn out to be, policy areas that cause a lot of problems for ordinary people. Again, I'm thinking about the ban on cars, petrol and diesel cars. That's the second biggest thing that most people buy in their life. That's if they're lucky enough to buy a house, which of course increasingly people aren't. So I'm afraid I think the party does have to make a choice. I think the choice starts literally now in the bars and the back rooms of the MPs deciding who they're going to let through to the second round, who they're going to block from going through to the second round. All these things are happening. And I think the public could call on the right of British politics to lead again quite soon. And if the party votes right, but that vote ends up being split between a Tory party desperate to look united and a resurgent Reform Party, and Labour getting again, even though the public don't want that, then there's going to be a real sense, crikey, not only has the right of British politics failed, but the whole of British politics has failed.
Thank you, Liam. James.
I think the direction that the current government is going has given the Conservative Party the biggest breathing space it could ever have hoped for to redefine itself. And that is definitely what the Conservative Party needs to do after the last couple of years. And as Liam said earlier on, the public want to be led.
Our panelists, thank you to our audience for coming. Lots of great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around them all, but they were brilliant. There's some really interesting conversations that sparked off from that as well. Thanks to the SMF for organising and doing this event. They've got a brilliant team. It's been an extremely fun panel to chair. I will just plug the SMF's Wonk Week newsletter. They read all the research reports.
Very good.
Yes. It's very good. It's short. It's fun. It's very informative. And yeah, thank you, everybody.